welcome to the Sheldrake-Vernon Dialogues with myself, Mark Vernon, and Rupert Sheldrake. Hi, Rupert.
Hello, Mark.
So today we thought that we would talk about a day which was held at the beginning of July 2022 for Rupert, marking his 80th birthday, a gathering of colleagues and friends and people who are interested in his work. And it was not just a celebration, as you might expect, but was also a very fascinating day, picking up on different themes, things that I hadn't heard about even, as well as deepening a sense of what Rupert's work's been about and the legacy that it's generating even now. And so I thought, Rupert, if you were willing, we might talk about some of the things which came up during the day from the speakers and give people a sense of that, a kind of broad overview of your work, which in some ways, although we talk regularly and you talk regularly, it's perhaps useful to do, maybe helpful as well to do.
Well, yes, I'd love to do that, Mark. Personally, I found it a wonderful day. I found it really helpful myself, because it brought together different strands of my life and interests in a way that hasn't ever happened before. So it was for me a unique occasion, and so I'm delighted you were there, actually, not just there, but taking notes. So you actually remember what was going on, perhaps better than most.
Yeah, well, that's the way I thought we could do it. Is just in a way go through most of the speakers, at least, who spoke on the day, and I pick out something that stood out to me, and then we could talk around that and then move on and just see how it kind of unfolds. And it began at St. Bride's, Fleet Street, which immediately I thought was very Rupert Sheldrake, because it's in a church in the centre of London, and you all have often said that making contact with holy places, in particular places, is a key inspiration for you. And then Guy Hayward, another of your collaborators who works with you on pilgrimage and also the Evensong website, he talked about why the church is there and how there's Bride's Well, an ancient well that now feeds a tremendous plane tree in the churchyard, but that how Bride's Well is a saint that was both in the pre-Christian world and the Christian world, Bridget and Bride. And immediately that kind of whole sense of connection and digging down as well as reaching across and seeking the current manifestation of these things, as well as being open to previous and indeed future manifestations, felt like exactly the right spirit. And then this was underlined by the fact that the day began with a blessing from Richard Charters, the former Bishop of London. And he made a very interesting remark about how in the Garden of Eden there are the famous two trees of the knowledge of good and evil, and then the tree of life, the tree of wisdom, and how the tree of wisdom, the tree of life, is precisely the one that can put knowledge into context, can make connections that can enable us therefore to participate more richly with life. So that whole sort of setup immediately connected us to the spiritual significance of what you do. I hope it, I guess it, I don't know whether you thought that quite through so fully before, but I guess you were glad that that was all becoming present as we began the day.
Yes, well, I didn't know so much about the history of St. Bride's until Guy pointed it out. But I loved the fact that the day started with a blessing from Richard Charters. And it was a wonderful blessing that he gave. And I did feel that as a result of it, the day really was blessed. So for me, that was a crucial part of the whole proceedings. And the fact that most people who were there for the day were able to be there a bit earlier for this blessing.
Why, let me ask a really obvious question. Why is it so crucial to you that it begins with a blessing?
Well, because I think blessings are open, is asking for an opening to the presence of God, really, and the grace of God. And Richard Charters included the priestly blessing as part of it. The Lord bless you and keep you. The Lord make his face to shine upon you and be gracious unto you. The Lord lift up his countenance, the light of his countenance upon you and give you peace. I mean, it's really about being in the presence of God and being blessed by the presence of God, which means, in perhaps less symbolic language, within the presence of the greater consciousness or the greatest consciousness. So it's really about putting the whole day in the light of something much bigger than all of us. And I thought that was a really important way. And as you mentioned, whenever I go to a new town or a new city or do anything, I try to go to the holy place at the center of it. In India, usually a temple or a mosque, but in Europe, a cathedral or a church or a chapel, or wherever the central holy place is. And our meeting was at the St. Bride Foundation next to St. Bride's Church. So having the blessing there in the local holy place seemed to me the best way to connect with the place, the tradition, the divine presence, and bring us all into that presence there to start with. And the fact that we ended the day with a nano pilgrimage, walking to St. Paul's Cathedral for choral evensong, framed at the end of the day also this being in this space, St. Paul's Cathedral being huge. I mean, it's literally vastly bigger than any of us. And with the soaring music of the choir echoing in that space, it gave the sense of this much greater presence and greater reality. And so I think it's really putting everything into this context of something far greater than ourselves. And personally, I think that's very important. I mean, I meditate and I pray every day because I think it's important to have one's life in that larger context.
And I guess that you see the vocation of the scientist in that context as well. You know, sometimes scientists will remark, I think as Einstein put it, that they feel they're gazing into the mind of God when they're studying the natural world. And it was remarked during the course of the day that to study the natural world is in some sense to study the divine. But maybe with this blessing and this framing, it's about calling forth that consciousness to know it more fully yourself. And so maybe even, would you say, become a kind of collaborator with it, a co-worker with it in the knowing?
Well, yes. I mean, I think that first of all, I think that the whole creation is ultimately comes forth from divine creativity, or creativity has a kind of divine source. And the creative, active principle in the whole of nature is the Holy Spirit, or the conscious creative power that works through all nature. And then I think of God as sustaining all nature. I mean, that's part of my own way of seeing it. And of course, it's not just me, it's a very traditional way of seeing it in theological terms. So yes, and I think that the scientific exploration is something that we as humans are able to do. And I think that it's something we do because we're part of that creative spirit. I think our minds are part of the greater mind that underlies all things, and akin to the minds of all the living beings in nature. So I see this as all part of a consistent and fitting together. And I see what I'm doing and what other scientists are doing as revealing more or exploring more of the nature of nature. And I think we're only able to do that because our minds have this affinity with nature, and they have an affinity with nature because they have a common source with nature, namely in the ultimate consciousness that gives rise to all things.
So this sense of harmony, resonance was immediately taken up by the second speaker of the day, who was Jill Purst, your wife. And she talked a bit about how you met originally because of a shared interest in science. This was something I hadn't fully appreciated, that Jill had been working with a group of scientists on the phenomena of spirals in nature, which she has had a long-standing interest in. And then she led us into a chant, which was a very embodied, audible sense of participating together in a shared, well, if I say shared drone, I mean that in the way that drones often operate in music, that is like the background consciousness from which, in the chanting case, the overtones, the manifestations can be heard. And so we had a wonderful few minutes with Jill doing that. And then she took us to the sort of, I don't know, the big rupture, certainly, of your professional life, by reminding us that one of your children's, Merlin and Cosmo's, first images of you was watching a television program called Heretics, where a picture of you had been pinned to a wooden door, immediately to be engulfed by flames. And so this took us to the publication of A New Science of Life, and what was the completely unexpected reaction to that at the time.
Well, yes, I think Jill's contribution was, absolutely set the tone in the sense that the chanting that Jill does is about the resonance, the power of resonance, and the overtones that Jill makes are the harmonics. It's all to do with resonance. And so her work and mine fit together in an extraordinary way, because morphic resonance sees resonance as an underlying principle in all nature, as a kind of metaphor with sonic resonance, but chanting and making that embodied gives us the direct experience of resonance, and by chanting together, of resonating with each other. But as you say, Jill also showed some of the dynamics that have underlain my career, because starting off as in a fairly conventional scientific way with, as a research fellow of the Royal Society, a fellow of Clare College, Cambridge, principal plant physiologist at the International Crops Research Institute in India. All that really came to an end when I was denounced as a heretic by the editor of Nature in his famous book for burning editorial. And that meant that my career was forced into a different direction. I mean, I think he hoped I'd just be driven out of science and would sort of disappear. But it forced me to take a different way of doing science, to do it in a more independent way outside scientific institutions. In fact, it forced me to become a kind of feral scientist. So it was a key step in my career, and Joel sort of set the tone really for the day by both the connection and the resonance and so on, and also by this divergent moment when my career took this very different track from a normal scientific career.
And the encounters, conversations, confrontations, even with various skeptics, did pop up across the course of the day. I mean, one of the nicest moments was when Cosmo, one of your sons, remarked that one day he was introduced to Lewis Wolpert, who has died fairly recently, but Lewis Wolpert was one of your protagonists. And Cosmo announced to Lewis Wolpert, "We pray for you," which I think caught him quite by surprise. But there was a tremendous sense of when you have these encounters, you've, at least in public, always held on to not just the scientific method and following the evidence and wanting to build the case, and not be constrained by dogmas and doctrines, but also with generosity towards others, realizing that we're all fighting our own battles as well as leading our public lives, but also with, as someone put it, your puckish sense of humor, and how humour is really important, actually, because it makes for an openness that enables intellectual inquiry, in fact, when it is holding things with the right energy, the right tension. And that was something that came across really well too.
Yes, I was very interested that Cosmo said that, because this happened when he was really quite young. I should think 5 or 6 or something. And we said prayers every night, when Merlin and Cosmo went to bed. And Cosmo went to church with me every Sunday, as Merlin did. And actually, it was Cosmo's idea. He said, "Daddy, at church, they said you should pray for your enemies." And he said, "You have all these enemies who want to burn your books and so on." And so we actually did indeed pray for John Maddox and Lewis Wolpert and others. And so I was very surprised when we met Lewis Wolpert. He didn't remember the circumstance. We were in Hampstead High Street, and Lewis Wolpert, who lived nearby, was riding past on a bicycle, and he stopped and said, "Hello, Rupert." I mean, although we were enemies in terms of scientific principles, we were quite friendly in person. And so, and I was with Cosmo, he was walking along with me, and I was holding his hand. And then he looked up at Lewis Wolpert, and I introduced him. I said, "Cosmo, this is Lewis Wolpert." And then he knew his name from all this. So that's when he said, "We pray for you." And we did indeed. Well, I think, you see, one of the things that has helped me a lot is that I had all these attacks from skeptics and the attack from the editor of Nature, I mean, many of which I thought were grossly unfair and ad hominem and broke all the rules of scientific discourse. And, obviously, some of this made me really angry. And in some of my earliest writings, I started with polemical denunciations of conventional science. And one of my friends, who was a molecular biologist at Cambridge, who was quite interested in what I was saying, said to me, "Look, if you start by attacking everything I think I stand for and all the research I do, I'm not going to want to read anymore." And so it became clear to me that being angry wasn't going to help serve my cause, and it didn't serve me either, because it was, really annoying to feel angry and upsetting. And so, and that's partly through Christian practice. I pray the Lord's Prayer every day. I have done for decades. And so the bit where it's "forgive us our trespasses as we forgive those who trespass against us." Well, these people certainly had trespassed against me, and they hadn't asked me to forgive them. And I didn't feel like it at first, but I asked for God's grace to forgive them. And actually this anger evaporated. I mean, when I saw they're all fighting for the truth as they see it. I mean, they're not people. Their anger with me was not so much with me as a person, but with the ideas I was putting forward. And so when I realized they're doing what they think is right, and they see themselves as warriors for truth, it's just a much narrower conception of scientific truth than I would like to think of, then it was much easier to live with this and not to be too upset by it, and not to be gnawed at by resentment and stuff. And it just made my life much easier, much freer, and much more fun.
Yeah. You mentioned there that another effect of this denunciation was to make you a feral scientist. But I wonder whether maybe it's a truer scientist in a certain sense, because David Lorimer, who was the next person to speak, he made the remark that part of the problem with the modern way that science is done is that people know very little about the history of science, and indeed the lives of scientists, and how eclectic and even eccentric they could be. And I remember once being in your house, in your library, some of which we can see behind you even today, and the range of books there. And I remember you pointing to me a copy of Newton's Optics, which I don't suppose many people have a copy of. And you said that you'd read it partly because at the end of the Optics were all these big questions that Newton asks and reflects upon. And it's the spirit of that inquiry, which can range very widely and freely and draw in all sorts of things that partly inspired you. And then David Lorimer underlines this because he read out a greeting from Ian McGilchrist, another contemporary scientist whose work ranges very widely and very freely and is therefore remaking slowly how these things are imagined and conceived. And in McGilchrist, it was a very remarkably fulsome appreciation of your work for the freedom that you have pursued this vocation of being a scientist with, and that he understands because he shares it as well.
Yes. Well, it was very generous of Ian to write those very kind words. But I think that he and I are two of the very rather rare examples of independent scientists. And there aren't very many independent scholars. I mean, you're one of them, Mark, yourself. You know, you're an independent scholar with a very wide range and covering a lot of topics. But those of us who are not working within the academic world do have a freedom that academics can't enjoy. I mean, what academics do have is regular salaries and prestige and regular careers and pensions and graduate students. I mean, there are lots of advantages to it. But they're often constrained by their colleagues and their departments and their many commitments to administer departments and sit on government committees and all that kind of thing. They're very constrained in what they can do. And those of us who work outside that system don't have the financial security. We don't have the social prestige and so forth, but we do have a much greater range of freedom. And that is enormously important for me anyway. And I know it is for you as well, and clearly is for Ian McGilchrist and David Lorimer, who organized this whole event, is again very free, because running an organization like the Scientific and Medical Network, which goes beyond the normal academic and scientific boundaries, it's a liberating thing.
And the liberation, to pick up on the next speaker, who was yourself, showed up in many ways in what you said, but partly it's the freedom to keep focused on the very fundamental questions, because you talked a little bit about your earlier life and inspirations around you. But the story I remember particularly now was when you talked about one day seeing some willow trees that had grown because they'd been planted as stakes in the ground with barbed wire strung between them. But the willow trees had come back to life and left the rusting barbed wire hanging. And it was such a vivid image because you said that this was, you were young when you saw this, but then it revisited you several times. The way in which modern science claims to study the natural world, which, if anything, is a living world, an organic world, a dynamic world, and yet seems to have forgotten that very basic element, and so doesn't know how to bring in these living qualities, which of course is one of the things which you've worked on. So this freedom to revisit the most fundamental things, and from those very basic things realize that, as Mary Midgley, the philosopher of science, used to put it, how strange that the life sciences become life blind, addressing that very basic thing which you've done.
Yes. Well, it was that image, that experience, which happened to, I must have been about 5, of seeing these stakes, how they'd come to life and turned back into trees, was really an image for so much of my scientific career, because most of it is about how nature is not dead, unconscious and mechanical, but alive, organic, and with a kind of mind or soul or consciousness. And my book, The Rebirth of Nature, was where I most expressly put that view across. And also, of course, it's a theme in The Science Delusion, where I show how the 10 dogmas of mechanistic materialism, when turned into questions, open up whole new ways of looking at nature, and they lead us back to a sense of nature as alive, the universe as an evolving organism, memory inherent in nature, nature made up of organisms at different levels of complexity, as opposed to the reductionist view. So actually that image, which I mentioned, was curiously resonant with almost all my scientific career thereafter. Because even in my more technical work in botany, one of the key themes there was the way that dying cells give rise to new life. Dying cells release the hormone auxin, which stimulates more growth and more development. And as more growth and development happens, more dying cells occur within plants as new wood forms and as new veins in leaves. The xylem or wood cells die as they differentiate, they dissolve themselves. And as they do so, they release the hormone that causes more growth, more wood formation, more roots to grow, and so on. And so it's really this interplay of life and death. It also features in my recent paper in the Proceedings of the Royal Society, Cellular Senescence, Rejuvenation, and Potential Immortality. It's really about the interplay of life and death. That childhood experience had, I wouldn't say it caused these other things, but it was certainly fitted remarkably well with so many other things in my scientific work.
And just to stress that that's work on the senescence of cells that is work that you were developing early in your career when you were still leading a conventional scientific career, but you're now visiting again because it feels like it's an idea coming back. And Alex Gomez-Martin, who was a next speaker, he gave us a wonderful overview of the range of the work that you've been involved with, from work around the nature of plant life through to what he called the mysteries of everyday life. He made this very nice remark that why study seances when so many people are living with dogs that know when their owners are coming home? How actually many of the mysteries of life are right slap bang in the middle of everyday life, not in strange fringes. And that this citizen science, as it's also been said, that you have worked at, partly out of necessity, because running experiments must be possible cheaply when you don't have the backing of great institutions behind you. Both brings more people into the scientific endeavor, educates people about what science can be, but also makes people have a very felt direct connection with it, even with strange things that are happening, and feeling that that can be investigated and understood and be acceptable quite as much as, well, actually pretty much everything in the natural world's strange when you look at it in one way, but sometimes we forget the strangeness, the wonder, the mystery of it. But it was good hearing from him to get that sense of the range of work, but also what he's working on with you right now in the area of consciousness, and how your ideas of morphic resonance are very productive of ways of investigating what's sometimes called extended mind, that you're working on with him.
Yes, well, Alex Gomez-Martin is a very highly intelligent, creative young scientist, and it's very fortunate that we've been able to have this collaboration and friendship over the last 2 years, almost, entirely by Zoom, really. This meeting in London was the very first time we'd met in person. But he and I got together because we share an interest in the philosophy of Bergson, Henri Bergson. And the two aspects of Bergson's work we're working on together is, one is the extended mind in space, which I think can be tested and explored through the sense of being stared at, which is another mystery of everyday life. The feeling of being looked at and turning around to find someone's looking at you is something 95% of people have experienced. It's extremely common, widespread. And yet completely unexplained scientifically. It ought not to happen from the conventional point of view. We're writing a joint paper on that at the moment. And the idea that memories are not stored inside the brain, which is an idea that I first learned about from reading Bergson, is one of the key ingredients in my whole idea of morphic resonance and memory in nature. And so Alex and I are also working on, we're planning to write a joint paper on memory and the brain. So I was really pleased he was there, because he's, through discussing these aspects of consciousness with him, it's possible to bring more clearly into focus what can be said in a scientific context. We're planning these papers for mainstream scientific journals, and ways in which some of these ideas could influence the course of mainstream scientific research.
Now, that there were several other contributors to the day, some very well known like Matthew Fox, others like Keith Roberts, who you work with. He worked on illustrations for your book. There was as well David Luke, who is well known in some quarters for his psychedelic research, and he's worked on the paranormal side of things. But maybe a nice way just to draw our visiting of the day to a close would be to mention Pam Smart, your long-standing assistant, who very wittily talked about what it's like to be Rupert Sheldrake's assistant. She one time found herself in a cage with a gorilla as a result of putting together a possible experiment. She met you because she was the owner of the dog JT that had these very striking capacities to know when the owner was coming home, and led to a series of experiments that became more and more robust as you were able to build in more and more controls and respond to challenges. But I wanted to link what Pam said with what Merlin said, your other son. We've talked about Cosmo a little, and Merlin gave a very lovely talk where he showed how maybe one unexpected effect of his, what he called biological education from you and from Jill, was this business of focusing on the use of the passive voice in science. Now, this might sound a bit technical, but he explained in his talk, and then I talked with him a bit more afterwards, about how profound this is, because the effect of saying the test tube was taken, the test tube was cleaned, the agents were added to the test tube and so on, which you're trained. I remember getting told to write scientific methodologies like that at school. But it removes the person, the scientist, from what's going on, and so just continues this sense that somehow the universe, if it's seen properly, is a dead machine that somehow works like clockwork according to fixed laws without any kind of conscious or soulful engagement at all. And Pam's witty accounts of what it's like to actually work with a scientist was one side of realizing that humans are always present, and the imagination and creativity and courage indeed is part of the scientific endeavor. But Merlin particularly summarized it when he was talking about this business of the campaign to get the passive voice moved to the active voice, which I understand is happening in quite significant ways now. So this is a campaign that's being won. But he made this very nice remark at the end. He said, one thing that he'd learned in all that he's learned from you is that I am really here, and so are you. So are numerous other beings, seen and unseen. And it was a very simple but very wonderful invocation of how science can be done with this participative, fully engaged, enriched experience of life, which of course he's written about in what's now becoming a very successful book of his own, Entangled Life. It was lovely having all that dynamic so richly present, as well as the tangible things, not least of which is campaign against the passive voice.
Yes, it was wonderful that Merlin could give that talk, and of course Merlin's book Entangled Life and his whole approach really do help to bring this idea of living nature into public awareness in a most effective and profound way. Yes, it was the thing about the passive voice was so interesting, because when he was at age 11 was forced to write that way at school, which is what triggered off my interest in this, because I'd stopped writing in the passive voice years before, and most scientists that I knew at Cambridge and elsewhere had also stopped using it. Even my John Maddox at Nature, who I disagreed with about so many things, as we mentioned, thought that reports should be in the active voice, and Nature was one of the journals that took the lead. So it was rather surprising to me to find that leading schools were still teaching students to write that way. And when I did a survey of more than 250 secondary schools in Britain and found that more than half were teaching in the passive voice, and that I was appalled to find this was still going on. And even some that were teaching in the active voice didn't want to. One respondent was the head of science at a comprehensive school in Mansfield in Nottinghamshire, who said, "It's hard enough to get my students to write anything at all, let alone to write it in such an artificial style as the passive voice." He said, "However, if I taught in a better school than the one I teach in with different kinds of students," he said, "I'd do it if I could, but I just can't." So there was somebody who was teaching the active voice not because he thought it was better, but because he, through a sense of failure at being able to get anyone to write in this artificial style. And actually, his students were right. This was much better to write in the active voice. And this was one of my more successful campaigns, actually, because I wrote articles about it in New Scientist, the School Science Review. And Lord May, who was then president of the Royal Society, was extremely supportive and went so far as to say, in this day and age, any scientific report written in the passive voice shows it to be a second-rate work. He said it was the mark of second-rate work to be written in the passive voice. But still, some schools are still teaching people to write that way, because it's a deeply embedded convention to do with this false image of scientists as somehow totally detached from the universe and utterly objective. And as we know, the replicability, the reproducibility crisis in science, which shows that most scientific reports can't be replicated, has brought about a new kind of humility within the sciences, ones I've never seen before. But this false image of scientists and their false image of themselves was enhanced by the passive voice. And I'm really glad Merlin brought up that point.
And it's really important because it affects the whole cultural attitude towards science, which I guess for most people is to sort of put them off, because they feel, what's this got to do with me? When in that particular sense, the science has been saying, well, it has got nothing to do with you. You're supposed to remove yourself. So it's, it's one of these subtle issues that actually in the longer term, might make a lot of difference to people's appreciation of science, but also to what becomes acceptable science as well, as the human presence, the human soul, the human consciousness and so on is seen to be so crucial to how we engage and participate with the world in this sort of interactive way.
Mm.
Well, look, it's fun to talk through a few things from the day. I hope, dear listeners, that has given you some sense of what was such a good occasion in all these different ways. And I hope it's been nice for you, Rupert, just to revisit a few of the things as well.
Yes, thank you very much, Mark. I don't normally like to talk about myself, but since this was about my 80th birthday and organised by the Scientific and Medical Network, it did give a whole day to reflect on these things. And actually, it's really helpful to take it a little further through our conversation now. So thank you very much for that.
Cheers for now.
Bye for now.